Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. My name is Felicia and today I'm going to run you through the cinematic settings that I use for the A7R Mark II. You see, in conjunction with my FS7 sometimes on jobs, I do use my A7R as well, and I tend to use it for a lot of gimbal work, so I do want them to match as close as possible. Therefore, I mostly use cinematic settings, or the most cinematic settings I can get out of this camera. Now don't switch off just yet. If you don't have an A7R, it doesn't really matter. You can still use the tips in this video to get similar results, regardless of what camera you have. First things first, let's talk about file formats. File formats are going to determine the resolution of your image, so it's pretty much the first step in getting a cinematic shot. You're always going to want the best image possible out of your camera if you're going to be playing around with it in post and getting that cinematic look. Therefore, if you're using the A7R Mark II, what I tend to do is I use 4K UHD 100 megabits per second, and that gets me the best possible quality out of the camera. Just a little bit of a note here, if you are shooting 4K, you are going to need the fastest possible card to read and write that 4K. So I use the SanDisk Extreme Pro 95 megabits per second. For off-speed work, the A7R Mark II does go down to HD. Now, if I'm doing any off-speed work, I tend to just set it to 50 frames per second, which is still an HD file. It is a little bit smaller, obviously, than the 4K file, but I am able to mix both of those in post without much issue. It does really depend on what you're shooting. Just remember, if you do change it to 100 frames per second, your image will also drop in resolution again. But it's not by much, so you really won't have any issue. Speaking of frames per second, I see a lot of videos on YouTube saying that 24 frames per second is the best thing to use if you want a cinematic shot. And yeah, I mean, a lot of films are shot in 24 frames per second and screened in 24 frames per second, but it isn't the be-all and end-all of a cinematic shot. So you just choose whatever frame rate you deem correct for what you're shooting. Although, in my opinion, 24 frames per second does look a lot more pleasing to the eye than 30 frames per second. Okay, so moving on to focus settings. Now this largely depends on two things: what are you shooting and how much control do you have over the camera. If you do have control over the camera and you're able to adjust focus while you're operating, I'd recommend just setting it to manual. That's the key to a cinematic image. Having more control over your image is paramount. On the other hand, if you're not able to actually manually adjust your focus, let's just say you're using a gimbal and you have to have two hands on that gimbal at all times and you can't adjust the focus ring, then I'd probably recommend setting it to auto. My favorite preferred settings are a fast motor speed that ensures that the focus changes quickly. I also put face detect on because in most cases I am shooting people or myself. And then I also make sure that the field of focus is in the center. That kind of hits all bases and it's fast and accurate, but that also depends on the lens you're using. So currently on my A7R, I have a lens adapter, so I'm using an EF lens, which means that it will be a little bit slower or a little bit sluggish depending on what lens you have on the other end and what mount adapter you're using. But if you're using a native lens to your camera, so if I was using this GM right here, it would be perfect. Alrighty, let's talk about picture profiles. Picture profiles are where you select the gamma levels for your image. This is to achieve the best dynamic range possible out of the camera. Currently, I use S-Log2 with a cinema profile, and that gets me the best result. But I have seen that other people are using settings that aren't S-Log2, and they are getting an easier grade in post and with less banding. So I am interested in doing a little bit of research into this and seeing if maybe there is a better option, or trying out different picture profiles and doing a bit of a comparison. So if that is something you are interested in seeing, leave a comment down below because I'd be interested in doing it. There are heaps of exposure tools on the A7R Mark II. I tend to use the metering mode, and I make sure that it is a multi-section metering, so it's going to evaluate the whole image and get a readout overall, and then I can adjust from there. I usually, for S-Log2 with a cinema profile, like to set it anywhere from plus 1.7 to plus 2. I just make sure that plus 2 isn't flashing when I set it, because that might mean that it is too overexposed. And you don't want an image that is too over or too under, because sometimes it can be hard to bring it back in post, especially if it's over. There are other exposure tools that you can use if you don't want to use the light metering mode in the camera. You can also use a histogram. There is a small histogram. If you hit display a few times, you'll see that pop up on your screen. It is fairly accurate, but it is small and quite difficult to read compared to something like a waveform or something a little bit more accurate like that. But the option is there if you do want it. Also, there is the option to turn on zebras and set your threshold accordingly to what you're shooting. I don't like zebras. I think they just clog up the screen too much and things get a bit confusing when they're on because there's stripes everywhere. But if you want them, they're there. A good method to working out which percentage threshold for zebras you should use is by using Ansel Adams' grayscale chart. Basically, it's a chart numbering from 0 to 10 with what you should have exposed in each of those values. So if you think 0 being black and 10 being white and you convert that into percentages, it'll be 0% and 100%. Highly recommend you have a look at it because it is quite a valuable source. It's not an exact science. Every situation is different, so really have a look into it and use your better judgment. Another thing that's quite hard to change in post, so you'd really want to make sure you nail it in the camera, is white balance. Please don't use auto when you're using white balance. It can jump around quite erratically, especially if you're shooting in conditions where there are multiple colors of light sources. So I've got a daylight light here and then I've got a tungsten behind me. So that might be a little bit difficult if this camera were on automatic white balance. The key here is to make sure you set your white balance to the Kelvin of your main light source. So I've set mine to daylight because my Westcott is 5600 Kelvin. On the A7R you do have presets as well, so you can set it to fluorescent, shade, daylight, tungsten, and there's even some custom settings in there as well. I personally just like to dial it in with the Kelvin setting. That way I know if I've got it exactly right. The next thing is to make sure that your shutter speed or your shutter angle is set to double your frame rate. So if you're shooting 24 or 25 frames per second, you make sure it's 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting 30 frames per second, 1/60th. If you're shooting 100 frames per second, 1/200th, you get the point. That is, unless you're going for a jittery image or any motion blur. In that case, you'd set it less or more than your frame rate. Speaking of jittery images though, do make sure that you turn steady shot on. That will really assist you with your handheld motion and it will just make for a more stable shot. Of course, it's not absolutely perfect. You do need to implement your own stabilization by suspending your arms or using a handheld rig or a gimbal as well, but it is something handy to use. Finally, let's talk about some overlays that you can use to assist you in your setup. Focus peaking. I tend to set mine to red and I make sure it is on a low to medium setting. It does depend on the contrast of your image. This will help me determine what is exactly in focus. There is actually another option for focus as well, where you can set it to zoom in when you start trying to focus and then it will come back out to your regular image. That is also a really handy option to turn on. And finally, markers for aspect ratio. If you're shooting something that is going to be a stereotypically cinematic shot and you want to get that 2:3:5 look in post, you can put an overlay on top of your footage that will show you where those guides are. There are also other options out there if you're not using 2:3:5. Anyway, those are the cinematic settings that I use for my A7R Mark II. If you have any different settings that you like to use for your camera, leave them in the comments down below because I like to learn new and different ways of doing things as well, and I'm sure everybody would appreciate it. So thank you very much for watching that video. I hope you got something out of it, and if you did get something out of it, please remember to give it a big fat thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more of my face and learn a little bit more about filmmaking in the process, remember to subscribe, and I'll see you next Sunday.